Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I sat there in the car, waiting, like I always did, routine, predictable. That's how my life had become with Sarah. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and I was parked a block away from the hotel where she was supposed to be attending another one of her business meetings. She said it was a client dinner, something important, something that couldn't be skipped. I checked my watch, 6:15 p.m. She'd been in there for an hour already. I shifted in my seat, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. A low-level hum of unease had been gnawing at me for weeks now, something just below the surface, just out of reach. It was like a persistent itch in the back of my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore. I used to dismiss it, telling myself I was paranoid, that work stress was making me see things that weren't there. But now, sitting here alone, I couldn't shake the feeling. I folded the newspaper in my lap, pretending to read while glancing occasionally at the hotel entrance. The minutes dragged, and with every passing second, the unease festered, blooming into a full-blown ache in my chest. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Sarah hadn't been herself lately. We'd always had a good marriage, or at least I thought we did. But something had shifted in the last few months. The late-night work calls, the sudden emergencies, the way she'd avoid my gaze when I asked about her day. I knew she was stressed, her job demanding as always, but this was different. Colder, distant. I told myself I was being ridiculous, overreacting to things that didn't mean anything. But now, sitting outside this hotel for the third time this month, I wasn't so sure. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood back. Our early years together had been good, really good. Sarah was vibrant, full of energy. We used to laugh a lot, spontaneous nights out, trips to places we'd never heard of. She was my partner in every sense of the word, and I was proud of the life we'd built together. But lately, that energy had vanished, replaced by something hollow. She was always distracted, always preoccupied, and no matter how much I tried to reach out to her, she kept slipping further away. I opened my eyes and glanced at the hotel entrance again. The image of her walking through those revolving doors earlier flashed in my mind. She hadn't even kissed me goodbye this time. Just a quick, "I'll be late, don't wait up," as she rushed out the door. I replayed the moment over and over, trying to pick apart the pieces. What was I missing? Her phone had buzzed during dinner last night. Twice. She didn't even flinch. Just turned it face down on the table, a forced smile as she complained about work. I wanted to ask her about it, to press her, but the words stuck in my throat. She was irritated, on edge. If I pushed too hard, she'd shut me down, brush me off like she had so many times before. I knew that routine too well. That's when the doubt started to creep in. The mysterious phone calls she ended abruptly when I entered the room. The unexplained absences. The sudden scent of a new perfume that lingered on her clothes, one I'd never smelled before. All small things, insignificant on their own. But together, they painted a picture I didn't want to see. A picture that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. I glanced at my watch again, 6:30. She was still in there. I should go home. I should trust her. But I couldn't. Not this time. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to shake off the growing sense of paranoia. This was insane. I was insane, right? Sitting outside a hotel like a private detective, waiting for some proof of something I wasn't even sure of. But then again, maybe I wasn't. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if I wasn't wrong? What if everything I'd been trying to brush off, all the little things I'd been ignoring, weren't just my imagination? A surge of desperation coursed through me, mixing with the anger that had been simmering just below the surface. I needed to know. I couldn't live in this limbo anymore, this suffocating fog of uncertainty. I needed to see it with my own eyes, no matter how much it might destroy me. Before I realized what I was doing, I opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the hotel entrance, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was just going to look, maybe ask the front desk about her meeting, nothing more. Just enough to put my mind at ease. The lobby was quiet, polished floors gleaming under the soft lights. I approached the front desk, my mouth dry, forcing a smile as I asked the receptionist about a dinner reservation for Sarah. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Harris," she said, glancing at her computer. "She's been a regular guest here recently." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Regular? Since when? "Did you say regular?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but my throat was tightening. The receptionist nodded, oblivious to the bombshell she'd just dropped. "Yes, she's had quite a few meetings here lately. Mr. Harris has been very generous with her. She's quite popular." The room tilted for a moment, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. "Mr. Harris? Popular?" I managed to thank her before stumbling back toward the entrance, the cold evening air slamming into me like a wave of ice as I stepped outside. I felt like I was suffocating, the oxygen ripped from my lungs. I stood there frozen, the full weight of the truth crashing down around me. It wasn't just an affair, no, this was something else entirely. She was meeting clients, charging them. My wife was, no, I couldn't even say it in my head. But the pieces were fitting together too perfectly to ignore. Her late nights, her secrecy, her distance, the new perfume. The money she never explained. I leaned against the wall of the hotel, my legs weak, my mind racing. Everything we'd built together, everything I thought I knew about her, about us, it was all a lie. She had turned our life into some grotesque parody, using her business meetings as a cover for something dark and twisted. Anger surged through me, white-hot and blinding. I felt it bubbling up, threatening to explode, but I kept it in check. Not here, not yet. I needed to think. I needed a plan. As I made my way back to the car, the numbness started to set in. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to, but the truth was undeniable now, staring me in the face. Sarah wasn't just unfaithful. She had betrayed me in every possible way. She had made a mockery of our marriage, of me. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The shock was still fresh, the pain gnawing at my insides. But underneath it all, there was something else taking root, something dark, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Revenge. The thought slid into my mind so smoothly, so naturally that I didn't even question it. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. She deserved more than that. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt, seeing how deeply she'd cut me. No, I was going to make her feel every ounce of the betrayal she'd inflicted on me, slowly, deliberately. She thought she had me fooled, thought she could continue living this double life without consequence. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. I wasn't weak. I wasn't the kind of man who would just roll over and accept this. Sarah was about to learn what it meant to destroy someone's life. As I started the car and pulled away from the hotel, a cold calm settled over me. My mind was already working, piecing together what I would do next. This wasn't just about getting even. This was about reclaiming control, about making sure she understood exactly what she had done to me. I would bide my time, gather what I needed. I would let her think she had gotten away with it. And when the moment was right, I would strike, hard. The betrayal had torn something inside me, but it had also awakened something else, something darker, something far more dangerous. I didn't just want to confront her, I wanted to destroy her, and I would. The next morning felt like an out-of-body experience. I got up, showered, dressed for work, all on autopilot. My mind hadn't stopped racing since the moment I left that hotel. The shock still hadn't worn off, and I didn't know when it would. The thought of what Sarah had been doing, the lies she had spun, kept replaying in my head like a broken record. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. There was a hollowness in my eyes, something I hadn't seen before. I had always thought of myself as a rational man, someone who handled things with logic and reason. But now, all I could feel was that anger, that deep-seated burn that had taken hold the moment I realized what she had done. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I went through the motions, making my way downstairs to the kitchen where Sarah sat, casually sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had changed, as if everything in our world was still intact. She glanced up when I entered, offered me a quick smile, and went back to whatever was holding her attention on that screen. That smile. It took everything in me not to grab the phone out of her hand and throw it across the room. I knew that smile was a lie. The perfect wife, sitting there, pretending like she wasn't out destroying our marriage night after night. I sat across from her, the tension between us a silent weight. My coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. I tried to force myself to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't ready yet. Not for this, not for the confrontation that was bound to come. Busy day? She asked, eyes still on her phone. I could barely look at her. Yeah, meetings all afternoon. I could feel her eyes flicker up to me for just a second, like she was testing the waters, trying to see if I was still oblivious to her deceit. But I kept my face neutral, calm. She didn't need to know what was going on inside my head, not yet. After breakfast, she kissed me on the cheek the same way she always did before she left for work. It felt different now, cold, empty, like she was going through the motions, just as I was. I watched her walk out the door, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, and then I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. I wasn't sure how long I could keep up the charade. Every part of me wanted to scream at her, demand answers, demand the truth. But that wouldn't be enough. I needed to be sure. I needed to know everything before I made my move. Once Sarah was gone, I made my way back upstairs. Her laptop was sitting on the desk in our bedroom. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it up, my hands trembling slightly. I knew her password. She wasn't careful with those things, never had been. I wasn't surprised when I got in on the first try. Her emails were clean, too clean. She must have been deleting them regularly, covering her tracks. But I wasn't looking for emails. No, I was interested in her calendar. The meetings, the dinners, the client calls, I needed to match them up, see if there were any patterns, any gaps that didn't add up. As I scrolled through her schedule, the pieces started to fall into place. There were hotel reservations, some marked with dinner with client, and others labeled simply as meeting. It all lined up. I could see it now. The places, the times, everything clicked together like the final pieces of a puzzle. My heart raced as I scanned through each entry, and it wasn't long before a familiar name appeared. Harris. That's when it hit me. Harris wasn't just some random name the receptionist had mentioned. He was a repeat client, a regular. I slammed the laptop shut, unable to look at it anymore. The rage was simmering again, bubbling up just beneath the surface. But I wouldn't let it take over. Not yet. I still needed more. I needed undeniable proof before I did anything drastic. I spent the rest of the day at work, but my mind was elsewhere. My phone buzzed several times with messages from Sarah, casual texts about her day, about dinner plans, about whether we needed anything from the grocery store. She was so good at pretending, so damn good. But now that I knew the truth, her words felt like poison. Every message was a reminder of the betrayal I couldn't shake. By the time I left the office, it was dark outside. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight as I drove, and before I knew it, I found myself heading back to the hotel where she'd met Harris. I didn't know why. Maybe I just wanted to see it again, to confirm that it wasn't all some horrible mistake. But the cold reality settled in quickly as I pulled into the parking lot. I parked in the same spot as before, staring at the revolving glass doors where I'd watched her walk in with him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel that same sickening mix of anxiety and anger creeping back in. I sat there for a long time, watching people come and go, wondering if Sarah had been with someone else since last night. Wondering if she'd ever done this when I thought she was working late or out with friends. The thought made my stomach turn, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to lose control now. After what felt like hours, I got out of the car and walked into the lobby. The same receptionist was there, her face a mask of polite indifference as she greeted me. "Good evening. How can I help you?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to smile. "I'm looking for someone who was here yesterday evening. My wife, Sarah Harris, she had a dinner meeting." The receptionist glanced at her computer screen, typing something into the system. After a moment, she nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Harris was here, meeting with Mr. Harris. They've had a few meetings here recently." I felt my stomach lurch. There it was again, Mr. Harris. The confirmation I didn't want but knew I needed. "Did they stay late?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The receptionist gave me a strange look, then shrugged. "I believe they left shortly after their meeting. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" I shook my head, my mind reeling. "No, that's all, thank you." I turned and left, my body on autopilot as I made my way back to the car. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was that name, Harris. The way she was so damn casual about it, like it was a normal part of her life, like she had no idea how deeply she was destroying me. I got into the car and sat there staring at the dashboard. It was happening again, the numbness, the disbelief. But underneath it, the rage was still there, waiting for its moment. Sarah had lied to me for months, maybe even longer. And now I had the confirmation I needed. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend like this wasn't happening. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, half expecting another one of Sarah's sickeningly normal texts. But it wasn't her this time. It was my buddy, Mike, asking if I wanted to grab a beer after work. He had no idea, of course. No one did. No one could have guessed what was happening behind the scenes of my perfect marriage. I stared at the message for a long time before I responded. I wasn't in the mood to talk, to pretend like everything was fine. But maybe I needed the distraction. Maybe I needed to be around someone who didn't see the cracks in my world. "Sure," I typed back. "Meet you at the Brick." The drive to the bar was a blur, my thoughts tangled in a mess of suspicion, anger, and fear. When I arrived, Mike was already there, nursing a beer at our usual corner table. He grinned when he saw me. "Hey, man, long day?" he asked, sliding a beer across the table to me. I forced a smile, taking a long swig. The cold bitterness felt good, grounding me. "Yeah, you could say that." We talked for a while, mostly about work, sports, and the usual nonsense. Mike didn't ask about Sarah, didn't push me about anything personal, which I was grateful for. He had no idea how close I was to snapping, how every casual comment he made felt like it could break me. But as the night wore on, I realized something. This, talking, laughing, pretending everything was normal, wasn't helping. It wasn't taking away the burning desire for revenge that had been festering since last night. If anything, it was making it worse. I couldn't escape it, couldn't ignore it. The anger was consuming me, turning every thought I had into something dark and vengeful. When I left the bar, I made a decision. This wasn't going to end with a confrontation. Not yet. I needed to plan, to gather every piece of evidence before I made my move. Sarah thought she could keep lying, that I was still in the dark. She had no idea the storm that was coming for her. I was going to destroy her, piece by piece. And it started now. I drove home, my mind clearer than it had been in days. I was going to follow her. I was going to watch her, track her movements, see where she went, and who she met. I'd install a tracker on her car if I had to, hack into her phone, whatever it took. I needed to see it all for myself. I needed to make her pay. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Sarah was already asleep upstairs, her perfect life still intact. For now. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring up at the stairs, my chest tight with the weight of everything I knew. The woman sleeping just a few feet away wasn't the woman I married. She wasn't the person I thought I loved. But she was going to learn what it meant to cross me. I'd make sure of that. Tomorrow, it all began. I didn't confront her that night. I wanted to. I nearly did. But I stopped myself. Not because of fear or weakness, but because I knew that confronting her now would be giving her an easy out. She didn't deserve that. She deserved worse, far worse. I spent the entire night pacing around the house. Every inch of the place felt tainted now. Every room was filled with memories of us, of her lies, her deception. Our bed was the worst. The thought of her coming home, sleeping next to me after being with those men, it made my skin crawl. But I couldn't let the disgust, the rage, consume me. Not yet. My mind kept looping back to Harris, the name I now couldn't shake. How long had he been part of this? How many times had he walked out of the same hotel where I sat in my car like an idiot, waiting for her to come out with some fabricated excuse? I couldn't stop thinking about him, wondering who he really was and why he had become such a fixture in her life. The answer was clear though, wasn't it? He wasn't just a client, he was something more, something darker. By the time the sun crept through the blinds, I had made up my mind. Confronting Sarah right now would be pointless. I needed leverage. I needed evidence. Something indisputable. Something I could use to tear her life apart the way she'd torn mine. And that's exactly what I intended to get. The first step was simple. Track her every move. That morning, while she was in the shower, I slipped into the garage and with trembling hands, I attached a small GPS tracker to the underside of her car. It was discreet, almost invisible. She'd never know it was there. She thought she had been smart, careful even, but she underestimated me. When she came downstairs, dressed for work, I played the role of the oblivious husband perfectly. I kissed her on the cheek, handed her coffee like I always did. She smiled, genuinely I think, but I couldn't even look her in the eye without feeling the bile rise in my throat. She was the same woman who had shattered my world, but she didn't know I was onto her. That was my power now. As soon as she left, I dove into my next task, her phone. The idea of going through her personal things made me feel sick, but I wasn't going to let my own discomfort stop me. She had no problem hiding things from me. This was just leveling the playing field. I knew her password, of course. She hadn't bothered to change it in years. It was laughable, really, how careless she had been. I pulled up her text first. Nothing. She was smart enough to delete anything incriminating. But her social media? That was a different story. I sifted through her private messages, scrolling past harmless conversations with friends until I found what I was looking for. There it was, conversations with Harris. They weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. The tone of them was enough. He was asking when he could see her again, and she responded with an eagerness that turned my stomach. I felt a wave of rage, but I swallowed it down. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself, labeling the folder something innocuous so she wouldn't suspect a thing. Emails were next. As expected, her inbox was clean, too clean. But what she didn't know was that I could recover deleted emails. I spent the next hour painstakingly going through her trash folder, pulling up emails she thought were gone forever. That's when I hit gold. There were receipts from the hotel, confirmations of reservations, multiple ones, all tied to meetings with clients. It was there, in black and white, proof. I wasn't done. I needed more. I needed something that would make her squirm, that would destroy her from the inside out. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could. I tracked her every move using the GPS, watched as she went to her meetings, following her pattern, always at the same hotel. I didn't confront her, didn't ask her any questions. I played the long game. During the day, I'd focus on my work. It was the only thing that kept me grounded. But every night, I'd sink into that darkness, replaying her lies, replaying the image of her walking into that hotel. I installed spyware on her phone, tapping into her conversations, monitoring every call, every message. I became obsessed, consumed by this need to know everything. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. It wasn't just Harris. There were others. She had spun this web of deceit so carefully, but now it was unraveling, and I was watching it fall apart. The anger, though, didn't burn as hot as it had before. It had cooled into something more calculated, more deliberate. I was going to make her pay. The opportunity came a week later. I had been monitoring her phone in real time, watching as she texted Harris about another meeting scheduled for that evening. She didn't even bother to hide it. I knew where she was going, and I knew what she was doing. But before I could make my move, the phone rang. It wasn't Sarah. It was Harris. "James," the voice said when I answered, cool, collected. "We need to talk." I froze. How the hell had he gotten my number? "I'm sure you figured out by now what's going on," he continued. "So let me make something clear. You try to expose Sarah, and I'll ruin you." I gripped the phone tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What are you talking about?" "I know you've been digging into things," he said, his voice low and calm, like we were discussing business. "I've got connections, James. More than you know. And if you think you're going to bring me down along with her, I'll make sure it's you who gets burned. You'll be the one everyone blames." The words sank in like a knife. He wasn't bluffing. I could hear it in his voice. the confidence, the certainty. Harris wasn't just some random lover. He was powerful, connected. I realized then that I wasn't just up against Sarah. I was up against something far bigger. "You're threatening me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Consider it a warning," he said, his tone almost casual. "Walk away, James. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." I hung up without another word, my hands shaking as I tossed the phone onto the counter. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than rage. I felt fear, real, palpable fear. I had underestimated Harris, and now I was caught in a web I didn't fully understand. But I couldn't back down. I wouldn't. I had come too far to let this end with a phone call. I just had to be smarter, more careful. When Sarah came home that night, I acted normal, like nothing had changed. But inside, my mind was racing, trying to figure out my next move. The power dynamic had shifted, and now I was playing catch-up. I needed a new strategy, something that would let me take down Harris without getting myself caught in the crossfire. And then, the following evening, everything exploded. It started with a casual argument, something stupid. I don't even remember what set it off. But the tension between us had been building for days, and all it took was one careless remark from Sarah, one sarcastic comment about my work, and I snapped. I don't remember the exact words, but it all came tumbling out. How I knew what she had been doing, how I had followed her, how I had proof. I didn't even mean to say it, but once it was out, there was no going back. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. But then, just as quickly, her expression changed. The fear was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she said, her voice icy. "You think you've got it all figured out." I stepped toward her, my fists clenched. "I know enough." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You don't know anything, James. You don't know what this marriage has been like for me. You've been checked out for years, so don't act like the victim now." I stared at her, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you're not the only one who's been lying," she shot back. "I've been telling people about you for months. Everyone thinks you're the cheater." The words hit me like a slap. I felt the ground shift beneath me, everything tilting. "What?" "Oh, don't act surprised," she sneered. "You think anyone would believe you? I've been planting seeds for months, telling our friends, telling everyone that you've been cheating on me. They believe me, James. They all do." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. This wasn't just an affair. This was something deeper, something more sinister. She had been laying the groundwork, manipulating everyone around us, making me look like the guilty one, and I hadn't even seen it coming. As I stood there, my entire world collapsing around me, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. She had made sure of that. But she was wrong about one thing. I wasn't going down without a fight. I spent the next week unraveling her life. It was almost too easy. Sarah was already on edge, and I played into her paranoia perfectly. I started by moving small things, her keys, her phone charger, little items she used every day. She'd leave them in one place, and I'd quietly relocate them just out of reach, just enough to make her second-guess herself. She'd freeze, scanning the room, her forehead furrowing as if she was struggling to keep her composure. "Have you seen my keys?" she'd ask, her voice slightly trembling. I'd smile calmly, shake my head, and offer to help her look, making her believe it was all in her head. That's how it started. Subtle manipulation, feeding her paranoia in doses she couldn't quite process. At night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd watch her out of the corner of my eye. She was unraveling, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Her phone screen glowed faintly as she checked messages, probably from Harris. I had already set up a notification system on her phone. Every message she sent or received, I saw it in real time. The text grew frantic. "Are you sure no one knows?" Harris tried to calm her down, but I could sense it. He was getting spooked too. Their texts were terse, panicked. It was exactly what I wanted. The tension between them was growing, and I was the invisible hand pushing it. It wasn't enough to let her unravel quietly, though. I needed her to feel trapped, to feel like her entire world was closing in. So I started sending her anonymous messages. "I know what you've been doing. How long do you think you can hide this?" He's going to find out soon. I used a burner phone, an untraceable number. Each time her phone buzzed, I watched her pale in real time. Her eyes darted around the room, paranoia dripping from every glance. She didn't mention the text to me, but I could tell she was growing more and more suspicious. She started locking her phone, something she'd never done before, as if that would keep her secret safe. One night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the tension between us so thick it could have choked us both, I decided it was time. I set down my fork and cleared my throat. "So, how was your meeting today?" I asked casually, leaning back in my chair, watching her squirm under the question. She looked up, startled, eyes widening for a split second before she caught herself. "It was fine," she said, her voice tight, forced. "Just, the usual, long and boring." I smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached my eyes. "The usual, huh?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Like the one you had with Harris last week?" The blood drained from her face so quickly I thought she might pass out. Her fork clattered against the plate as she dropped it, staring at me, mouth slightly open. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, her hands trembling. I leaned back again, folding my arms. "Don't play dumb, Sarah. I know everything, Harris, the hotel, all of it." The color returned to her face, but not in the way I expected. Instead of guilt, it was anger. Raw, burning anger. Her lips curled into a snarl, and she pushed back from the table. "You've been spying on me?" she snapped, her voice louder now, her composure slipping. "How dare you? You're the one who hasn't been around, always distant, always working late. I had no choice." I laughed bitterly. "No choice? Is that how you justify it? Sleeping with clients, charging them for your time? You think that makes you the victim here?" She stood up, her chair scraping loudly across the floor, and pointed a shaking finger at me. "You don't know what this marriage has been like. You think you're so perfect, but you've been checked out for years. You never cared. You never loved me the way I needed you to." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't buy it. This was her last attempt at playing the victim, at making me feel guilty for her choices. "I didn't love you the way you needed," I repeated, standing up slowly, my voice cold and controlled. "You think this is my fault, Sarah? You think that justifies what you've done? You've lied to me, humiliated me, sold your body while I waited like a fool at home. And now you want to blame me?" Her face contorted, half rage, half desperation. "You're not going to ruin me," she hissed. "You can't. No one will believe you. They'll think you're the one who's been cheating. I've already made sure of that." That was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment she thought she had the upper hand. I let her sit in her delusion for a second, savoring the panic rising in her eyes as she realized I wasn't backing down. "Oh, Sarah," I said softly, stepping toward her. "You've already ruined yourself. I don't need to say a word." She blinked, momentarily confused, but I could see it starting to dawn on her. The creeping realization that I'd been 3 steps ahead of her this entire time. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd prepared. The text messages between her and Harris, the hotel reservations, the receipts, the deleted emails I had recovered. I tossed it onto the table in front of her. "Take a look," I said, my voice chillingly calm. "Everything's there. I've got enough to bury you." Sarah picked up the phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the evidence, her breath coming faster with each piece of proof. Her lips parted in silent horror as she scrolled further, her face growing pale again, this time with the realization that there was no way out, no lie that could save her. "You're finished," I whispered, stepping closer, my face inches from hers. "And you're going to watch everything you've built fall apart. You're going to watch it burn." She dropped the phone as if it had physically burned her. "James, please," she whispered, her voice trembling now, the anger gone, replaced by fear. "We can work this out. We, we can fix this." I shook my head slowly, my eyes locked on hers. "No, Sarah, there's no fixing this." I left her standing in the dining room, her world crumbling around her. I walked upstairs, ignoring the sobs I could hear echoing from behind me. It was the first night in months I felt like I could breathe again. The next day, I put the final part of my plan into motion. I sent everything I had, the dossier, the emails, the text messages, to Sarah's company, an anonymous email detailing her extracurricular activities. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. By the afternoon, she was being escorted out of her office, her career in tatters. I didn't stop there. That evening, I sent a package to Harris's wife. I made sure it was thorough. There was no way he could talk his way out of it now. He was going down, and I wasn't going to let him drag me down with him. Sarah tried to call me that night, over and over. She left voicemails, texts, begging, pleading for a second chance, for forgiveness, for anything. I didn't respond. I just sat back and watched as her life imploded, bit by bit, piece by piece, exactly the way I had planned. By the end of the week, she was a pariah. Her friends, her colleagues, everyone knew the truth. She was a cheater, a liar, and worse. Harris cut ties with her, leaving her to fend for herself. She had no job, no lover, no reputation left to salvage. And I wasn't done. I filed for divorce, of course, but I made sure to strip her of everything, our assets, our home, everything we'd built together. It was mine now. She had nothing left. The last time I saw her, she was leaving the house, a suitcase in hand, her face hollow, defeated. She didn't even look at me as she passed. I didn't care. It was over. I stood by the window, watching her car pull away, a strange sense of calm washing over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't consumed by revenge or hatred. I felt nothing. It was done. She was gone, and I had won. But as I stood there, staring out at the empty driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I was free, yes. I had reclaimed my life. But I wasn't the same man I had been before. Something inside me had hardened, calcified in a way I couldn't fully understand. The rage had left me, but it had taken something else with it. Something softer, something I might never get back. I turned away from the window and walked upstairs to pack my own bags. I had a new apartment, a fresh start, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But deep down, I wondered if I'd lost more than I'd gained. The collapse of Sarah's world was immediate, thorough, and absolute. It started with a phone call from her boss. She'd been called into the office under the pretense of an urgent meeting, and I made sure I was at home when she returned. I'd already heard enough to know what was coming. They had found everything: the receipts, the hotel bookings, the discrepancies in her calendar, the string of lies she had spun to justify her absences. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was fraud, deception on a corporate level. When she walked through the door that evening, she looked like a ghost of the woman I once knew. Her skin was pale, her hair disheveled, her hands shaking as they clutched the keys she wouldn't need anymore. "They fired me," she said, her voice small, as if speaking louder would break the fragile reality she was still trying to hold together. I didn't look up from my laptop. I know. Her head jerked toward me, eyes wide in confusion and fear. I let the silence linger, watching her crumble under the weight of everything. I had anticipated this moment, had replayed it in my head 1,000 times. But sitting there, watching her unravel in real time, the satisfaction was colder than I expected. It wasn't the fiery catharsis I thought I'd feel. Instead, it was quiet, measured, clinical. "What do you mean you know?" she whispered, as if the words themselves were dangerous. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked over to the kitchen counter where I had left a manila envelope. I slid it across the island toward her. Her eyes followed the envelope like it was a snake poised to strike. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, but her trembling fingers eventually reached for the flap. When she pulled out the documents inside, I watched her face fall. The divorce papers were there, of course, along with a detailed summary of our joint finances. Everything I had moved, everything I had claimed as mine. She was left with nothing. "You," she started, but the words caught in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. She had used those tears before, weaponized them to manipulate, to distract. They had no effect on me now. "You ruined everything," she finally spat, her voice cracking. "You did this to me." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "No, Sarah, you did this to yourself. I just made sure everyone knew." She threw the papers down and stormed out of the room, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I already knew what was coming next. Over the following days, her life fell apart piece by piece. Word of her affair spread through our social circles like wildfire. I made sure of it. I had sent an anonymous message to our closest friends, hinting at her indiscretions, providing just enough details to stoke their curiosity. Within hours, the rumors became fact, and Sarah found herself isolated. The texts from friends stopped, the invitations to social events dried up, and the look she got in public shifted from polite to disdainful. But that was only the beginning. The day Harris's wife received my package was the day Sarah's world truly shattered. Harris, who had once been the confident, controlling man on the other end of those secret messages, had been blindsided. His wife was ruthless. The divorce papers from her side came faster than mine, and with his marriage dissolving and his assets threatened, Harris did the only thing a coward like him could do. He threw Sarah under the bus. He cut off all contact, blocked her on every platform, and denied ever being involved. His priority was saving his own skin, and Sarah? She was just collateral damage. Sarah called me that night, her voice a broken whisper on the phone. I didn't answer. I didn't need to hear her beg. I knew what it would be: desperate attempts at apologies, pleas for forgiveness, claims of how she'd been wronged, how she was the victim in all of this. But there were no victims here, only architects of their own destruction. I had played my part, yes. But it was her choices that set the whole thing in motion. I just guided the collapse. I filed the final divorce papers the next morning. Our assets were stripped down, divided with precision. I had spent weeks beforehand quietly moving things, making sure I came out on top. The house, the savings, everything of value was legally mine. Sarah? She was left with debt, her name dragged through the mud, and no one left to turn to. She left town shortly after. I watched her pack her things, what little she had left, into the back of her car one cold, gray morning. I stood by the window, arms crossed, as she threw her last suitcase into the trunk, slamming it shut with more force than necessary. She didn't look at me, not once. She knew better than that by now. The moment the car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, I exhaled, feeling the weight of months of tension slowly dissipate. It was over. The battle was won. But as I stood there, staring at the empty driveway, a strange hollowness settled inside me. I'd won, hadn't I? I had done everything I set out to do. Sarah was gone, ruined. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity. I should have felt triumphant, victorious. Instead, I felt empty. There's something they don't tell you about revenge, something no one talks about. They tell you it's sweet, that it's satisfying, that it's worth the cost, but they don't tell you how cold it leaves you. How, when the fire of your anger burns out, it takes something else with it. It leaves a void where the heat once was. For the first time in months, the house was quiet. Too quiet. No more tension hanging in the air, no more hushed phone calls, no more lies to uncover. Just silence. I packed my things that evening, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I couldn't stay in the house we had shared, the house where every wall, every room, was soaked with the memory of her betrayal. I had already found a new apartment, a fresh start, a place where I could build something new, untarnished by the past. The move was quick, almost methodical. I didn't take much with me, just the essentials. I left behind the things that tied me to the life I had shared with Sarah, the photos, the furniture, the memories. They weren't mine anymore. They belonged to someone else, someone I wasn't sure I recognized. The apartment was small, but it was clean. Modern, cold, in a way that felt right. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window that night, looking out over the city. The lights flickered in the distance, cars moving like ants below me. I had the window cracked open, just enough to let in the cool night air. It felt good against my skin, refreshing, like something new was settling in my bones. For the first time in a long while, I was alone. Truly alone. I thought about Sarah, about Harris, about everything I had done. I wasn't sure if I felt regret, maybe a little. But not for what I had done, only for what it had cost me. I had reclaimed my life, yes, But in doing so, I had lost parts of myself, parts that were softer, kinder, parts that trusted. I was harder now, colder. The man who stood by that window wasn't the same man who had waited outside that hotel, staring at his watch, hoping his wife would return from her meeting. That man was gone, but I didn't feel grief for him. He had been naive, a fool. He had let himself be played, manipulated, used. I wasn't that man anymore. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe that was what this had all been about, finding out what I was capable of, who I really was when everything else was stripped away. The phone buzzed in my pocket. It was my lawyer, confirming the divorce was finalized. I glanced at the message briefly before slipping the phone back into my pocket. The final thread between Sarah and me had been cut. I stared out at the city again, watching the movement below. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. But I did feel something else, something quieter, more profound, peace. I was free, but I wasn't sure if I liked the man I had become to get here. I turned away from the window and walked deeper into the apartment, the quiet wrapping around me like a second skin. The sound of my footsteps echoed softly off the bare walls. I hadn't furnished the place yet, hadn't decided what I wanted it to look like, what kind of space I wanted to build. For now, it was just an empty canvas. And maybe that was enough. For the first time in months, I was free to decide what came next. But deep down, I wondered if I'd ever truly be able to leave the past behind. The quiet of my new apartment became my sanctuary and my prison. After Sarah left town, there was no more drama, no more lies or secrets to uncover. I had won, yet there was a hollow silence that lingered. I had cut her out of my life, stripped away the poison, but the scars remained. Sometimes I found myself standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out over the city, watching as life carried on below me. Cars moved, people walked, the lights blinked in the distance, oblivious to the wreckage of a life just a few floors up. There were moments when I felt the satisfaction of what I'd done. I had reclaimed control. I had destroyed Sarah piece by piece until there was nothing left of her. I'd taken back my dignity, my pride. No one would ever look at me and see the fool who had been played, lied to, cheated on. My reputation was intact. I was intact, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I didn't miss Sarah. That much was true. The thought of her laugh, her touch, had turned into something ugly and bitter in my mind. She was a stranger now, a ghost that used to occupy my life. She wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with. That person had never really existed. The Sarah I'd thought I knew had been a mask, a lie. Once the mask had slipped, there was nothing underneath but a hollow shell. But what haunted me wasn't her. It was me. I'd become someone else in the process of tearing her down, a man I didn't fully recognize. I had thought revenge would heal me, that reclaiming my life would restore the person I used to be. Instead, it had stripped something away, something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. I had spent months plotting, planning, manipulating the pieces of Sarah's downfall like it was a game of chess. And in doing so, I had lost whatever softness I once had. There was a time, before all this, when I was the kind of man who believed in second chances. I believed in love, in loyalty. I believed in Sarah. But now, I wasn't sure what I believed in anymore. One afternoon, I found myself going through old photos, wedding pictures, vacations, moments that, at the time, had felt real. I stared at a photo of us on our honeymoon, Sarah's arms wrapped around my neck, her smile bright and full of life. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen her smile like that. Or maybe she had, and I just hadn't noticed. How much of it had been a lie? How much of my marriage had been an illusion? Every moment, every memory felt tainted now, corrupted by the knowledge of what she had been doing behind my back. I shoved the photos back into the drawer, disgusted with myself for even looking. That life was over. I had to stop going back to it. I started going to the gym more often, trying to burn off the restlessness that clung to me. I kept myself busy with work, projects that filled the hours, but the nights were the worst. It was in the quiet of my apartment, alone with my thoughts, that the weight of everything settled in. It wasn't guilt exactly. I didn't regret what I had done. Sarah had deserved every consequence, every piece of the destruction I had brought down on her. But what I felt was emptiness. Revenge had consumed me for so long, had been the force driving every action, every decision. And now that it was over, now that I had won, I didn't know what to do with myself. The anger that had fueled me had burned out, leaving nothing in its wake. I had spent so much time focused on Sarah's downfall, but I hadn't given much thought to what came after. The phone rang one evening. I let it go to voicemail. It was my lawyer again, reminding me to finalize some paperwork on the divorce settlement. I stared at the blinking message light for a long time before picking up the phone and deleting it. The divorce was done. Sarah was gone. There was nothing left to say. A few weeks passed, and I started to adjust to the new rhythm of my life. I went to work, came home, and spent my evenings trying to find things to distract myself. I told myself that I was okay, that I was moving on. But late at night, when I was alone in bed, staring at the ceiling, there was always that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that I wasn't the same man anymore, that I had lost something in the process of getting my revenge. I had gained control, but at what cost? I didn't talk to many people about what had happened. Friends who knew about the divorce would ask in hushed tones how I was doing. They expected me to be devastated, heartbroken. But I wasn't, not in the way they thought. My pain had come months ago when I first found out about Sarah's affair. That was when my heart had broken. That was when the world had shifted. Now, I was just hollow. They didn't understand that. How could they? From the outside, it looked like I had won. I had come out on top, stronger than before, but inside I felt like I had been hollowed out. The city moved around me, constant and indifferent. The world kept spinning, people kept living their lives, and I was just one more person lost in the flow. I would watch the couples walking by, holding hands, laughing, completely unaware of the betrayals and heartbreaks that could be waiting for them. I envied their ignorance. One night I went to a bar not far from my apartment. It was quiet, mostly empty, just a few people scattered around. I sat at the counter, nursing a drink, staring at the rows of bottles lined up in front of me. The bartender glanced over once or twice, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I was lost in my own head. A couple sat at the far end of the bar, laughing softly, their hands intertwined. I watched them out of the corner of my eye, the way they leaned into each other, the way their smiles seemed genuine. I wondered if they had secrets too, if there were things they weren't saying to each other. It was hard for me to believe in love anymore. Hard to believe that people could be that happy, that trusting. I had been that person once, hadn't I? The man who believed in love, who trusted completely. I wasn't that man anymore. I left the bar after a while, the cool night air biting at my skin as I stepped outside. I walked down the quiet street, the sounds of the city, a distant hum in the background. My hands were shoved deep in my pockets, my mind wandering. I hadn't planned for this part. I hadn't planned for the aftermath of my revenge. I had only focused on the destruction, on reclaiming my life. But now that I had it back, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I stopped at the edge of a park, staring out at the empty benches, the lampposts casting long shadows across the grass. The peace I had craved, the quiet I had thought would bring me closure, felt more like a void now. A space I didn't know how to fill. I didn't miss Sarah. I didn't miss the life we had. But I missed the man I used to be before all of this. The man who had hope, who believed in things like love and trust. The man who hadn't been burned by betrayal. That man was gone, and I didn't know if I could ever be him again. The cold crept into my bones as I stood there, staring at nothing. Eventually, I turned and walked back to my apartment, the weight of my thoughts heavier with each step. By the time I got home, the city had quieted, the streets nearly empty. I stood at the window again, looking out over the skyline, the lights blinking in the distance. I had my life back. I had my dignity, my pride, my freedom, but I wasn't the same. Revenge had given me control, but it had taken something from me in return. I was harder now, colder. I wasn't sure if that was a victory or just another kind of loss. For the first time in months, I was free to decide what came next, free to build a new life, to move forward. But as I stood there staring at the city, I realized I wasn't sure what that looked like anymore. I wasn't sure who I was without the rage, without the need for revenge. Maybe that's the cost of betrayal. Maybe that's what Sarah had taken from me, something more than just trust or love. She had taken away my sense of self, my belief in who I was. I turned away from the window, letting the quiet settle around me like a second skin. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the peace I had expected, but it was something. I had my life back. But the man I had become, he was someone new, someone I wasn't sure I fully knew yet. Maybe that was okay. Maybe in the end, that was enough.